Okay, hello. Well, there's quite a lot of you in here. I wasn't sure how many people would come in. Who here thinks they're a sort of front-end developer? Who calls himself a front-end developer here? Oh, we've got a few of you. Who sometimes has to do a bit of CSS and would rather not? Oh dear. I'm kind of expecting to be hounded out of the venue now. My slides aren't advancing. Hey, is anyone at the desk? Hello, my slides aren't advancing on your screen, they are on mine. I love computers. Is that working now? It's like your screen is kind of frozen on one screen. I'm now going to debug the setup live. Hey, there we go. Right, excellent. So yes, I'm co-founder of Perch. I probably shouldn't talk about that here, being an alternate CMS, although we are all PHP because somebody has to write PHP. Also a product called Notice, which is where you'll find my slides. That's a product for public speakers. I do a whole bunch of different things on the web and have been doing for a very, very long time, since about 1996 when I sort of came out of working in the theatre and wondered what on earth I was going to do with my life and discovered the web, and I'm kind of still here, which is pretty cool. It's given me a very nice career and a very unexpected career. So really the important thing why I'm up here, I guess, talking to you is that I am a member of the CSS working group these days. It's one of the things that I do. I actually represent, I was an advised expert, and in being an advised expert to a working group like the CSS working group basically means you get a very expensive hobby, because it's totally unpaid. You just sort of turn up at meetings and try and help out. The Dutch organisation of web developers Frontiers have recently decided to become a member of the W3C and sort of use me as their representative. So they're kind of funding some of my work on CSS, which is really great. So I actually edit a couple of CSS specs. The sort of bigger one of those is multi-column layout. So I'm here really to talk a bit about CSS grid layout. Is anyone here actually using grid layout? Some of you, that's excellent. It's nice to see more hands go up as people start to use it. So we're kind of 2 years on from grid layout getting into browsers. And the nice thing about grid was we had this massive spec, which had taken a very, very long time to develop. I've been speaking about grid since sort of late 2011. It didn't actually get into browsers until 2017, making me some kind of CSS vaporware lady for a very long time. But it kind of lands in those browsers very, very quickly and very completely in a sort of really good state, which was sort of the first time something like that has happened. You know, we're used to things going into one browser and then we all sort of look and say, well, I can't use it yet, and wait until it slowly gets into other browsers. We sort of managed to land grid in pretty good shape across all the browsers, which was pretty cool. But I still hear this kind of thing. Oh, well, you know, I've already learned Flexbox. Why on earth should I learn grid? I find it very strange that 2 years on, we've still got people debating this kind of question, because they don't ask me stuff like this. No one says, oh, well, I know how to use colour in my web designs, so, you know, maybe I'll not bother using fonts. But they constantly ask me this: should I build my site using Flexbox or grid? And I think that 2 years on, it really is time that we stopped thinking about Flexbox and grid as if they were two separate layout methods, as if we're choosing between Bootstrap and Foundation, because they're both just CSS. They're both just values of the display property. The fact that they're separate, they've got separate names, is essentially working group process. We have these different specifications in order that we can kind of finish something and say, hey, this level of this spec is finished. Browsers, please go and implement it and make sure it all works. We used to have CSS, you know, CSS2 was one enormous specification. If what we have now in CSS was one single file, it'd be like those Encyclopedia Britannicas people used to have on their shelf. You know, it would be so much stuff. So we've got it all broken down into different things. But Flexbox and grid is display flex or display grid. We've got two values there of display. You should use the thing that suits the pattern that you're trying to build, not kind of see them as two completely separate things. Because in terms of browser support, there's not actually a whole lot of difference. Yes, there's a bit of support for Flexbox in older IEs, but it's pretty buggy. You're going to still have to be working around a lot of stuff if you're using Flexbox in those older IEs. So really, you're better off looking at which pattern you want to build and what makes most sense for that pattern, and then choosing the layout method that does that, and switching between the two if you need to. Now, you certainly don't want to be hobbling a brand new design, a brand new application that you're building today to the limitations of browsers from the past. So the patterns that you need to build, they tend to tell you which layout method you need. And the more you work with this stuff, the more you kind of realize, oh yeah, that looks like a grid use case, that looks like a flex use case. And actually, people get a little bit confused about when to use Flexbox. Now we've got grid. So that's the other thing I hear is, oh, well, I think I can do everything with grid. But there's a bunch of stuff that Flexbox does that it's really, really great at that we kind of missed. Because when Flexbox first appeared, we were like, this is a better way of doing a grid layout, because we've been using floats, and floats are a terrible way of doing a grid layout, and Flexbox is like a slightly better way of doing a grid layout. So we sort of moved our thinking around floats and kind of assigning widths to everything and lining things up so they looked like a grid. We assigned that thinking to Flexbox and thought, well, we'll try and make it into a grid. And of course, you can make it behave like a grid, and it's slightly better behaved than floats, but that's not really what it's for. What Flexbox is for is taking a bunch of stuff that has different sizes, different, actual size of the content, and laying it out in a way that is most readable. So kind of like this. That's not a grid. What you've got is a bunch of content that has different sizes, and you've allowed it to wrap, and you've just said, look, can the browser just sort this out for me and kind of make things a sort of sensible size and not squish a great big thing into a tiny column and not leave loads of space around a tiny thing? And that's what Flexbox does. It does this kind of squishy thing. You get all your stuff and it'll just sort of work it all out. You're distributing space inside the items or perhaps between the items with the alignment properties, but you're not making a strict grid. But sometimes you want a strict grid. Sometimes you want to have rows and columns all nice and lined up. And if there's a bigger thing, making that column bigger, it should make the whole column bigger, not kind of poke out into the next column. And that's when you want grid layout. And so you end up with something like this. Now, if any of those tracks had a small amount of content in, there'd just be space around it because we're making a sort of strict grid. We're making sure these things all line up nicely. If you're trying to make this kind of pattern by using Flexbox, then you probably want to be using grid layout. You're actually making your life hard if you're trying to force Flexbox to behave like that. And here's really a good rule of thumb. If you start putting widths on all of your Flex items to make them line up, that's when you probably want grid. So if you're adding a width to your Flex item, particularly if you're putting percentage widths on Flex items, and you're doing that to everything in your layout, really what you probably want is to use grid layout. So here's a common pattern. We've got a set of cards with some of my favorite aeroplanes. I really like aeroplanes. I'm learning to fly. It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do, but it gets me away from the computers for a while. So we've got 3 aeroplanes here, and they've got captions, and they're all just lined up nicely using Flexbox. And that works fine when we've just got one line of them. And then this happens. We've got some extra cards here, and we get our 3 cards at the top, and then below we've got 2, and so essentially they just share out the space, because all the cards can grow and shrink, so the bottom line, they can both grow, so they've shared out the space, and then they don't sort of line up underneath the cards above. Now you might want this pattern. If this is the pattern that you want, then great, job done, you can go to the pub. If this isn't the pattern that you want, if actually what you want to do is have your cards 4 and 5 line up underneath cards 1 and 2, that's when you need to think, I'm actually using the wrong layout method here. I probably need to use grid. And if you see these things as a choice, if you see them as interchangeable, it's pretty easy to do. So on one side there, I've got the Flex version. On the other side, I have got the grid version. You can see that on the grid version, we don't do things on the child element. And that's kind of another difference and why you might want to use grid layout. is that when you do things with grid, you typically do a lot of work on the parent container. You basically decide how you want that set up, you set your sizing and so on, and then you place the items in. When you're using Flexbox, you have to do stuff to the children. You have to set sizes and so on the child elements to control how big they are. That's sort of the difference there. And I think is why sometimes grid seems a little bit daunting at first, because it's the first time really in CSS we've had that idea of kind of doing everything on the parent and then just the child elements just falling into place. So we use grid and we end up with this pattern. And this is really the basic difference between these specifications. Flexbox is designed as a one-dimensional layout method, and that means we're controlling rows or columns, but not both at the same time. You can do either, but you're going to be controlling one or the other. If we're using grid, it's two-dimensional, and that means that we control the rows and the columns at the same time. We've got control over both. And two-dimensional alignment means more than just that very basic example of sharing out space and doing that and having things lined up in both dimensions. Two-dimensional alignment basically means that the grid works exactly the same way in both dimensions. And we don't always see that. On the web, block elements expand. In English, they expand, the block direction is straight up and down the page. And so in their inline dimension, they expand to fill up the full space. I mean, that's kind of one of the first things you learn when you learn about CSS. A block thing is going to get as wide as it can. Now, we don't expand things sort of height in the block dimension. We don't stretch something to be as tall as the viewport, for example. So you tend not to have spare space in your container in the block direction. Things tend just to be as tall as the content needs to be. We're sort of fairly used to that on the web. But if you do give it a length, if you set the height or the block size of that container, you will end up with space. And then all of your alignment and all the space distribution and so on works in both dimensions in exactly the same way. So you can start to play a bit with the block dimension. You can start to play a bit with height. You can start to constrain things by the size of the screen, perhaps with viewport units, and use that space to lay things out on the grid. And I think this is probably where we start to see some sort of new stuff happening in web design, because we've not had that ability with the layout methods of the past. We've not been able to do a lot of that, kind of having white space above things. Because with the floated layout, you leave a bit of space and something's going to kind of pop up and sit into it, because that's kind of how floats work. So another reason to use grid would be to work with these layouts which are restricted in the block dimension in some way. And a pattern that we sometimes see is this kind of thing, neat fixed height rows of content. You sometimes see this used for things like you'll have like a load of magazine articles or whatever, and they've got nice images, and you get these sort of patterns where people have put the text for the headline over an image, and it's all nicely lined up like little boxes, and it looks really, really beautiful. Until someone comes along in the CMS and adds an enormous heading, and it breaks out of the box. And you kind of end up with overflow like this. Now, you people all work with a CMS. I support a CMS. I still get people coming into our forum saying, how do we stop people putting too much text into our CMS because it's breaking my layout? That is still happening today. People are still trying to allow their content to essentially dictate the design or the other way around. And that's not great. And so we want to deal with this overflow situation. And I really do think that web design has always been a bit of a battle against overflow. You want to kind of fix the height of things. You want things to look neat. You want things to line up, and then stuff like pokes out of boxes and gets places that you don't want it to be. And so we're trying to fix some of that stuff. It's one of the nice things about working on CSS is you can try and fix these problems that actually, are the root cause of all sorts of other problems. So we do that in grid layout with min-max. The min-max function for track sizing, so instead of actually having just a track sizing function of 100 pixels, a track sizing of 100 pixels, we use this function, this min-max function. And we say, I want my minimum value for this track to be 100 pixels. So if there's not 100 pixels worth of content in the track, it will still be 100 pixels. It's not going to vanish to nothing, which is what things would do by default. But the maximum is auto. And the thing about auto when used for grid track sizing is it pretty much means big enough to fit the content. So if you have auto-sized rows, they keep on getting taller until they've run out of content, and then they're going to be that size. So auto's sort of quite useful because it's not going to have any overflow problems. So your minimum is 100 pixels, and your maximum is auto. And okay, that might not be what you want. You might not want that track to be bigger, but it's certainly better than having a bunch of overflow. So it's kind of this sensible type of stuff, this stuff that looks at patterns that people are trying to create on the web, says, right, how do we fix this? How do we make this behave in a sensible way so that people can get the designs they want, but they cope with the real world of content on the web? And really, all of this is just to say, you've got choice. We've got choice for the very first time, really, when doing layout. We've actually got the ability to look at a whole range of ways to build a pattern and say which one will work best, which one is actually going to get me the best end result, which is going to work with my content the best. And I think that's really exciting. And it's a shame when people say, I'm only going to use Flexbox for my layout because I know Flexbox, and not look at Grid, or the other way around. You know, decide that Grid is so exciting it can do absolutely everything. I fairly frequently get stuff in my inbox where someone is trying to recreate Flexbox with Grid or recreate floats with Grid. And I'm like, if you need a floated thing, use a float. That's what it's for. You know, these things haven't gone away. We've not thrown out all of CSS because we've got Grid layout. It's just something new that we've got. So you've got more stuff to play with. And this is, I like the fact that someone on Twitter actually picked this up from a workshop I was leading. And, you know, people often say, you know, oh, am I using grid layout right? Or am I using Flexbox in the right way? And this is pretty much what I say. You know, well, is it working? Because that's really what matters. You know, CSS specs don't tell you how to use CSS. We very, very rarely have something in a spec that says, don't use this for X. We don't say that. We make CSS to solve your problems, and then we sort of hand it over and say, hey, you know, do stuff with this, and let us know where it's not working out for you. Pretty much the only time you'll find in a CSS spec a sort of instruction to not do something, or, you know, to watch how you use something, is if it could cause an accessibility problem. That's something that we obviously care about in the CSS working group. It's something that I hope everybody here cares about. We want to make sure that things are as accessible as possible. And as we get all this new, exciting stuff to play with, they also bring with them the chances of us creating more messes for people by just not understanding what we're doing. So when we see that kind of stuff, we will put that into a spec to say, hey, you know, be careful. And there's an accessibility task force at the W3C who also look over specs and point out things where, you know, perhaps we've got things wrong because we didn't know about it. So yeah, so for Grid and Flex, really the main thing you need to worry about is content reordering and not creating a situation where the order of the visual order, the way things look like they're laid out, is different to the order in the source. Because in CSS, the source order is kind of king. What the order that your content is in the source is what the tab order will follow, and it's also the order that screen readers will read things out. And of course, more and more people are having websites read out to them who can also see the screen. You know, I've got a little Google Home thing that it can read stuff like recipes and so on out to me. I can see the screen. I've just got stuff all over my hands because I'm in the kitchen. I don't want to touch it. So I'm getting that sort of read out, but then it's a very jarring experience if that's all happening in a different order to what you can see. I also spent a couple of years as a keyboard navigator because I broke my elbow. And if you're tabbing around a site and you're jumping all over the place, that's a terrible experience. So that's something we need to be careful of. This is a really, really handy tool that Microsoft have brought out, this Accessibility Insight tool. It does all sorts of stuff. It's a Chrome extension. It does all kinds of checking for accessibility. The thing with accessibility is you can't really get a yes-no answer for a lot of things because, you know, it's kind of, it depends. You know, is this causing a problem? You need to test it with real devices and real users. But testing tab order is a very good way of checking that you've not disconnected the source and the visual display. So here's the tab index checker thing from that tool, and it's actually showing the order in which you move through a document. Really good, quick check that you haven't managed to disconnect the source and the visual view when you're building, particularly with Grid and Flexbox, because with grid, if you're positioning things around your grid, it'd be very easy to end up with, the first item being top left, and then the second item being like, 3 pages down, because you've moved things about. In general, if you want things to be in a different order, do it in your source, and then use the layout to gently move things around, rather than jumble stuff up with the power we've got with grid layout. So that's some stuff that we can do and some of the options we have, but I'm always interested in what we can't do, because I like solving problems with this stuff. That's why I've been involved with the web platform for so long. And I think in some ways we've pushed the problems that we had before kind of a level deeper. If we look at those cards again, we've got 2 cards displayed next to each other, and one of them has got lots of stuff in the caption, because that aeroplane's got a long name. And then next to it we've got the A380, which has got a very short name, and so the caption is smaller. And those captions don't line up. Now that might be fine, but in quite a lot of designs it's going to be much nicer if the captions also line up with each other, even if they've not got as much content as each other. The cards there are a figure inside an LI. The LI is a direct child of the grid, so the LI participates in grid layout, which is why the cards lay out on the grid. The figure is an independent grid. I've nested it inside the LI. It's got 2 columns and 2 rows. I'm using min-max to stop that caption area vanishing if there's no content, but I'm giving it a max of auto, so it's going to expand. But the thing is, that card knows nothing about the other cards. The internals of the card are it's like a separate little grid, all of its own. It doesn't know what's happening in the rest of the layout. It's just being its own grid. So why don't we just have an easy way to lay things out that are deep within markup on the grid? And this kind of comes back to a core principle of CSS. Only direct children can become grid or flex items because we say display grid. It's a value of display. Now, values of display don't inherit. We don't then make everything a grid all the way down when you change the value of display, because if you did, you'd have to then keep resetting display all the way down through your markup. CSS has this concept of normal flow or block or inline layout, and that's why you can write a web page, mark it up with nice structured HTML, and it will be readable. If your CSS doesn't load, it will be readable, because the browser has got some internal styles, it lays things out, it makes headings big, it makes gaps between paragraphs and so on. And so that's normal flow. Just like that, really, we've got there, I've got a heading, I've got a paragraph, then I've got a flex layout. So I've got an image, and then I've got some content next to it. But as soon as we have a flex item, the content inside the flex item returns to normal flow. So we're not having to constantly do that resetting thing. And so that's why my captions don't participate in grid layout. They're nested deep in the structure. So we can make their parent a grid, but it's a totally separate thing. But sometimes we do want our layout to inherit. Sometimes we do want child elements to participate in a sort of greater grid. Sometimes we want to have a 12-column grid and those direct children be able to lay out on the grid, but also their children or grandchildren as far down as we want. We want to solve that kind of problem. At the moment, the only way to do that would be to start flattening out the markup, taking the cards out of the list, removing semantic markup just to get a visual display. And in fact, it's worse than that, because to get anywhere close to that layout, we have to break source order. You end up, to take advantage of auto placement in grid layout, you'd have to break up the source order and do 2 images first, then 2 captions, which of course is utterly terrible. And we can't even do all of the design features very easily. I was trying to sort of put this together and it felt awful. It felt like I needed to go and wash my hands afterwards. It was like doing the layouts of the past. I don't know, who else built a site using tables for layout? You see, you're my people. I can remember doing this. It was all terrible. We don't want to go back there. That's not something that we want to be doing. We've got something else in CSS which is new, which has a sort of interesting effect on this issue of only the direct children becoming flex or grid items. We've got this concept of display content, which removes a box from the layout. Now, this is a really interesting thing. Now, we all know about display none. So if you say display none, it removes a box and all the children. It's as if that thing was not there at all. If you say display contents, it just removes the box but leaves the children. So it's potentially useful when you've got elements that you want to participate in the grid or flex layout, but they've got some kind of container which exists for semantic purposes. You know, something like a list. So here I've got some items, and then the item with the pink background, those are list items. And the markup looks like this. So a div with a class of grid. I've got two divs, which are direct children. Then we've got our UL. That's a direct child. It's got list items. They're not direct children because they're children of the UL. Then we've got another direct child. As the sort of relevant CSS. So our UL there has got the background color on it. The children of the UL has got the background color on it. And then the grid items have got that sort of sandy color on them. Now, if we say on the UL, display contents, the box of the UL disappears. And so the LIs get laid out on the grid. It's as if that box was never there in the markup. But they're still children of the UL for all of the reasons. The reason I'm using the direct child selector there for them is so you can see they've still got their pink background color because they are still a child of the UL, but the box has been removed from the layout. Now, this is incredibly useful if you have that kind of situation. You've got some markup, you need it there for semantic purposes, you want to remove that so that you can have these things lay out and participate in another layout. However, there is a horrendous accessibility bug with it. So if you look at Can I Use, it's all sort of lit up green for Chrome and Firefox. The thing is that when you say display none, very purposely, if you say display none, that removes the item both for the visual view and for things like screen readers. It's totally gone, which means then if you want to reintroduce it later, you can do that. That is a thing about display none. That's how display none is supposed to work. Everything else that is a value of display, it's supposed to only be a visual effect, which is what I was saying about the order thing with Flexbox and Grid. We don't follow the visual order, we follow the markup order. It should be the same for display contents. We should be visually removing that box, but leaving everything else about it in terms of its semantic information and the fact that it's in the accessibility tree, that should be left in place. When Firefox and Chrome implemented this, for whatever reason, they actually didn't do that. And so if you had a list that you did display contents on, it stopped being a list as far as things like screen readers cared. They are fixing it. Firefox have pretty much fixed this. Chrome have fixed. I think it is actually in the accessibility tree, and they've still got some things they need to do in terms of being able to focus the items, but they are working on it. Apparently it was really, really hard to sort out, but they're obviously very keen not to have an enormous accessibility problem with such a useful feature. So Can I Use indicates that there is this problem. I think we've also done the same on MDN, indicating that there is this problem if you use it. But display contents, potentially, once this is sorted, is going to be very, very handy for those kind of things. But it doesn't really solve the problem we've been looking at. It's an interesting thing. Solves a different sort of problem. But we've got this other issue where we actually want to keep our card backgrounds. We don't want to remove the box. We want to keep it, but we want to be able to line up the internals. And this is why we've got SubGrid, which is sort of the level 2 of the grid spec. So again, CSS working group process, CSS is broken up into levels. They're essentially like a feature release for that spec. So CSS grid level 1 is basically all the grid stuff that we've got and that we can now use. Level 2 is pretty much this SubGrid feature, because it's a big feature. And so it's allowing us to sort of do this feature release, basically, which includes SubGrid. So what it is a value. It's a value for grid template columns and grid template rows. And so let's have a look at how it works. You can already make a grid item into a grid. So you can have something which is displayed on a grid, and you can say display grid on that item, and you can give it its own column and row tracks, and you've then got another independent grid. You can keep on nesting these things. There doesn't seem to be any great performance impact of doing so. So you can, have grids all the way down, or you can make a grid item into a flex container, or whatever you want. You're just changing the value of display on the direct children. So what I've got here is I've got an outer grid, which is the thing which has got the border on. And then we've got an item nested inside it, and we've got a sub-item nested inside that. So that's sort of what we're looking at. If we turn on the Firefox Grid Inspector, if you're working with Grid, get yourself a copy of Firefox. They are doing some fantastic tools for working with Grid, with Flexbox, and also things like CSS shapes. So this is the Grid Inspector, and that's my outer grid on the parent. And you can see how the child is positioned, but you can see those lines are just running through the sub-item because it's not positioned according to those lines. We could have a look at the inner grid there. So there's my inner grid, and you can see how the pink item there is positioned by the lines on the inner grid. And we can actually select both in the grid inspector. So you can see then how we get a sort of mess of lines in the middle because those two things are actually independent of each other. We've started over with a brand new grid inside there. So SubGrid. It's going to let us selectively opt grids on grid items into their parent's grid layout. So if I want to create a subgrid on my columns, I'd say grid template columns, subgrid. So rather than defining the tracks, I just say subgrid. And I'm carrying on defining the rows as I want them. I want to have rows that are defined differently to the parent. I think that's probably quite a common use case. We want to have a 12-column grid, and we want to kind of inherit that down. Or we could create a subgrid just on the rows there. So I've still got my 3 1FR columns in the nested grid. They don't line up with the parent, but I've subgridded the rows. So I've now got 2 row tracks because that's what's there in that area, so the item is stretching over them. And we could also create a subgrid in both dimensions. That would tie the dimensions of the item completely to the tracks that we've got on the parent. There's a few little bits and pieces in the spec that are kind of interesting. Line numbers start from 1 inside the subgrid. You don't have to work out where it is on the parent and start your line numbering with whatever line you are on. You actually sort of restart. It kind of behaves just like your nested grid, except that the track sizing and number of tracks is taken from the parent. So here's the example. Subgrid column line 1 is actually on line 2 of the parent grid. When we're positioning something inside the subgrid, we're taking our indexing from the lines that are on the subgrid. Now, if you wanted to kind of know about the parent lines and be able to use those inside the grid, the thing to do would be to name those lines, because line names on the parent are passed into the subgridded item. So you can actually use the same line names. So if I named a line col start, I could then position an item against col start inside the subgrid. They just passed through as if they'd been defined on the subgridded item. You name lines on your parent there in square brackets, and that's naming the line, not the track. So actually the line has a name, the track sizing then comes after. So that's how you name your lines, and then you can just use that on your positioning your item. Now you can add to those. You might want to also name lines on your subgrid. If you're working kind of with components, you might want each of these little things to be sort of their own little thing with its own line naming and so on. You can do that. So we can add named lines by adding them after the subgrid keyword. So that means that we can name our lines and then we can position things on the subgrid. And those are then independent. They're sort of scoped just to that subgridded element. Now, because we haven't got track sizing in the subgrid to place our lines before and after, what you do is you name your lines after the subgrid keyword. So basically you have a string of line names for each line of the grid. So you're going to have to name them there, and then you could just use them exactly as before. We don't see people using line naming so often, sort of as a pattern, but it's quite useful sometimes to be able to do that. Grids have gaps. We have the gap and the row gap and the column gap property, and the subgrid will inherit those gaps, as I think you'd probably expect. If you've got a gap defined on the parent, the subgrid then has those gaps. So you can see that there. I've got the gaps are just running straight through the subgridded item, and things can be positioned near them. But sometimes you might have a gap on the parent, but you don't want the subgrid to use it. So we can actually change that. So if you've got a gap set on the parent of, say, 10 pixels, and you don't want to have that on the child, you could set gap or row gap or column gap to 0, at which point it kind of acts a bit like you've got a negative margin there. You can see there my grey item is now kind of eating into the space that would be the gap. So it acts really as if you put a negative margin on, and it sort of takes up that space again. So you're not tied to having gaps if you don't want gaps. Particularly with card-type layouts, you possibly don't want gaps between the items. But everything will still line up. If you imagine the line of the grid, which is what the grid inspector is doing there, the line of the grid kind of goes through the middle of the gap. And then any sort of, if you remove the gap, it's just sort of going to meet in the middle. And of course, sizing of items in the subgrid can change the size of parent tracks. In grid layout, if things are obviously set to auto, then they're going to change the size of the track. We've also got things like min content and max content keywords, which can allow us to size a track to the minimum size that content is, the maximum size. So they could affect the sizing right through the grid. So if we return to our airplane card example, that's how we get the captions to line up across the grid. We'd need to create a subgrid on grid template rows and make our card span 2 rows of that subgrid. The parent grid has a gap, which we removed, we don't want it. And the card captions now line up because they're basically in the same row. It's just that they're nested down inside the grids. So that's pretty neat. There's other little patterns that are solved by subgrid. As I've started playing around with this and thinking about the spec, there's a few other patterns that I think we can solve, although they're not obviously a subgrid problem at first. As you start to experiment, you realize that, oh, there's other things we can fix here. This is something which comes up quite a bit, and I'm pretty sure we've got issues at the CSS Working Group repo about this. You can target line -1 of the grid. So line -1 is the end line, either by rows or by columns, but it's only the end line of the explicit grid. So you've got this concept of an implicit and explicit grid. The explicit grid is the grid that you've defined by saying grid template rows and grid template columns. So you've defined tracks. You can get at line -1 of those of that set of tracks if you've defined them yourself. So here I've got 5 explicit grid rows, and because we've got explicit rows, I can stretch the large item to the end line of those rows. So that works really nicely. But actually, that's not really what we tend to have when we're using grid layouts. Let's say, because it's line 1 of the explicit grid, if what you actually have is any number of items that need to be dropped into the grid, and you don't know how many rows you're going to need to define, you can't get at line -1. This is what happens if you have implicit row tracks. If you're just saying, I just want grid to create as many rows as needed to take up my items. So here I'm just using grid auto rows. So I'm saying, auto generate me rows and create as many as you need for the items that I chuck into this grid. And I'm still trying to do this 1 to -1 thing with that pink item, but it's not going anywhere, because -1 is actually the first row of the grid now, because we don't have an explicit grid. And so there isn't actually a way to target the end line of the implicit grid at the moment. Now maybe that's something we'll solve, but I think SubGrid actually fixes a lot of these use cases. What you need to do is place the items into a container which uses a subgrid for the columns. So we still have the same column listing. We've introduced an extra container to put those items in. And that allows us to do this sort of thing. Now, the sort of repeating section is inside a subgrid. But we haven't got a subgrid for rows, so we can have as many implicit tracks as we want. The pink thing is basically just in that one row of the grid. So we get that effect of having something which can stretch the full height, even though we don't know how many items we have got. So that's sort of the code for that. What it does need is an extra container wrapping the items that we can then apply the subgrid to. But I'm not too worried about an extra div if it means we can sort of get that pattern without any strange calculations. It's certainly a lot better than trying to work out how many items you've got with JavaScript or whatever and get your height that way. So I think there's going to be a lot of little patterns like that we realize we can solve because we're not tied to just having one grid that everything has to sit on, which is pretty neat, I think. And I really like finding these little things and seeing if we can make them work. However, the bad news, there's currently no browser implementations out there in the wild of SubGrid. There is, can I use, looking very, very sad indeed. Slightly better news. They were all screenshots in my slides. Firefox is busy implementing SubGrid. I expect it will land in a version of Nightly very, very soon. So they were all taken from essentially a pre-release build of Nightly on a very flaky VM on my machine. So it is coming. It's being developed by Firefox. They're sort of doing that first sort of testbed implementation. And I really hope that very soon we're going to see that in Nightly so that everyone can download and have a play around with it. And it is really important that people get their hands on this stuff. And I know when something is in a Nightly browser and it's only in one browser, it's kind of like, oh, well, I can't use it in production, so why should I bother having a look at it? But it is increasingly important that people in the web community take the time to look at this stuff, because we are losing rendering engines. You know, we're losing the separate rendering engine that Microsoft Edge were using as they are moving to Chromium. And this is really important, because the only reason that I started talking about Grid and started pushing this forward, and perhaps the only reason that we got Grid Layout at all, is that the Microsoft team implemented it in IE 10. They implemented an earlier version of the spec, kind of a prototype, as it were, version of the spec, which is MS prefixed. It's in IE 10 and 11. It's quite different from what we ended up with, because it's a very complex thing to design and work out. So it was kind of this sort of early build of it. I saw that, I started talking about it, I started trying to push it forward, because I kind of realized this was what we needed, and I didn't want it to go away. I mean, having multiple rendering engines, you know, actually working on this stuff and engineers putting this stuff forward means that we have more places where things are designed. As we lose those, not only do we sort of lose different inputs into what the web platform should be, we also lose places where new ground can be broken. And so I think it's really, really important that when browsers, you know, like Firefox, are putting the time into starting to ship a new feature, that we then have a look at it and we let them know whether they're going in the right direction, whether there's anything missing, whether it's buggy, and also, you know, let the CSS working group know if it's not solving particular use cases. You know, we do have influence as members of the web community, and we need to use that. So, kind of how do we go about that? Firstly, tell browsers what you want in the platform. It's important that they know, because browsers are businesses, like the businesses that we run, and if you've got a product, you want to build the things for your product that people actually are asking for, not just build random things that seem interesting. Now, the engineers working on browsers, they might think, yeah, I'd really like to build SubGrid, but they're probably going to have to convince their managers to some extent, you know, that this is the thing that the team should be working on. Very small teams in browsers work on layout. It's something I've come to realize through my work in the you know, on CSS and things, that actually there's a very few browser engineers who are doing this stuff, and they're busy, and there's lots of things they could be working on. So we need to let them know what we want. So to start that, we can just literally go and show our support. This is the bug for SubGrid in Chromium, and you can even on my slides go to that QR code, it'll take you right to that bug. Don't leave me too type comments, that's a bit annoying. You can just go and star them. Just, you know, star the bug, say this is something that I am interested in. And that is useful, it shows there is interest. As I mentioned, Firefox are already working on it, and you can go and you can follow along with that bug. They're already working on it, but the nice thing about following a bug is you'll get notifications about it. So when it does actually land in Nightly, or if something changes, or if there's, you know, some sort of thing being discussed, then you can follow along. So that's kind of interesting to do as well. I mentioned that Edge are moving to Chromium. They've still got their user voice thing up at the moment, where you could sort of vote for features. The Edge engineers are actually going to be committing to Chromium, and they already are, so that's another place that you can go, and you can then let them know that you're interested in SubGrid. You know, please do this with any feature you think is important. If you find a feature that's implemented in one browser, you can be sure there'll be a bug for it on the other browser. Go and just star it. Just say, hey, this is something that I actually need. That's really important. It kind of shows interest in these features from the web community. If you think about it, really, you know, if you're browser A and browser B has implemented a shiny feature, and people are sort of interested in it and are using it, what you don't want is your browser look like it's falling behind because it's not got that feature. So it's kind of important that we show what we're interested in. And then write about features that you want to see in browsers. If you've got a use case for SubGrid, if you're like, hey, I really want to have this because it's going to solve this particular thing that I have been struggling with, or I'm having to do this suboptimal thing, or I'm having to use JavaScript to do this, and if I just had this, I wouldn't have to use JavaScript, and the site would be faster, and that would be all great. You write this stuff up because, again, it shows there is interest. It shows the working group there's interest too. You know, I've sat in many meetings where the question has been, and they often ask me because I'm a web developer as opposed to a browser engineer, they say, do you know if anyone's using this? Is there any interest in the community for this? And often, if I don't know, the way I find out is I'm just searching. Has anyone written about it? Has anyone said, oh, I really need this because of this? So, you know, that's a really good way to let us know what you want. And also, say, use new features because it shows that we want them. Sometimes, you know, we get a feature implemented in one browser and not in another, and everyone's like, well, I can't use it. Sometimes you can. It might only be on your own personal site, or it might be using it with a fallback. It might be using it in a very, very small way. But if you can, use those new features because browsers are watching. This is from Chrome status. The browsers are actually looking to see which things are being used in the wild. So this is for grid template rows. You can see how it suddenly does an uptick as people start to use grid layout. So browsers are actually looking to find out what percentage of people out there are using a feature. Now, if you're the browser that hasn't implemented it and you can see that people are starting to use it, then it's much more likely that you're going to actually start to break ground and work on that feature. So it's really important to do that. And then, you know, use new features when they're behind a flag, because that is when you get the chance to offer feedback. Once we've implemented some CSS, we've written the spec, it's gone into browsers, it's out there in the wild, it's there forever. You know, we can't go around breaking the web. We don't break the web platform. If you built a site, you know, I've got sites that I built, you know, before 2000, and they still work. And that's an amazing thing about the web, the fact that we have all of this stuff which just carries on working kind of forever. So we can't break the web. So once something gets out there, if you spot a glaring problem with it, then at best we're going to be able to kind of do some sort of weird workaround for it. When things are behind a flag in a browser, if you spot a problem with it, then we can quite probably change the spec. You know, then that happens. That happened with Grid. You know, that was behind a flag for about 5 years, and massive changes happened to that spec in that time as people started to build things and pointed out problems. We can do that when they're behind a flag. Once they get out there in the wild, we can't make those changes. So if you want to help to beta test the web platform, when you find things have come behind a flag, you know, enable experimental web platform features in Chrome. Firefox tends to have individual flags for each of the things. You know, toggle them, just have a play, have a think, oh, I've got a use case, you know, make a little example in CodePen. And if you do find there's a problem, then you can come and talk to the CSS working group. All of our work these days is now on GitHub. We use GitHub issues for issues with the web platform, so issues with specifications. It used to be that you had to join this horrendous mailing list if you wanted to follow CSS issues, and you'd then get hundreds and hundreds of emails, which were completely baffling, and were about very, very, you know, detailed bits of specs. Now it's all on GitHub. You can just like search the things you're interested in, and you can ignore all the stuff that is, you know, about something in the depths of some browser's rendering engine, and just look for the kind of the sort of stuff that really we want feedback from web developers for. I also do things like I'll try and tweet stuff. I mean, quite a lot of things are like, what should we call this feature? What's a sensible name for this thing? And I quite often will then go to Twitter and ask people for feedback. So you can find all the issues there. You see that the specs are all sort of, they've all got the name of the spec at the beginning, making it quite easy to filter on, you know, CSS Grid or what have you, and see what sorts of things people are asking and what kind of things we want to know in terms of the CSS working group, but also issues that the community have come and raised and said, hey, why can't we do this? And sometimes the reason we can't do this is because nobody in the working group actually thought about that, because none of us have never needed to do it. So, you know, that would be great. And the conversations are pretty technical and nerdy and sometimes seem quite argumentative, but it really is just that kind of trying to hammer out these things to make them as good as it can possibly be. We do all of our work in the open with the CSS working group, so when we discuss stuff in a face-to-face meeting or in one of our weekly calls. Everything is minuted in IRC, and we basically post the discussion back to the issue on GitHub. So when that issue is discussed, you'll be able to see what sort of things people said. We often end up with a kind of strange conversation where we have a conversation in person, the minutes get onto GitHub, and then people who had commented on the issue before then comment on GitHub on our conversation. And it's a bit of a slow process, but it kind of works, and it does mean that people can get involved who want to be. So please do, you know, in any of those ways, participate in the platform, because as people who build websites, who work with clients, who work in organizations, you're exactly the sort of people who should be involved in the platform, because this is, you know, this affects your work. You're essentially giving a gift to your future self by getting involved now, you know, with something like SubGrid, because you can help to make it better. You may well point out something that we haven't thought of. And it's an interesting thing to do. You know, I've given an awful lot of unpaid time to the web platform, certainly, but it's given me an awful lot back. I left school at 16 to be a dancer. I've got no sort of real training in any of this stuff, and yet I get to sit in a room with some of the cleverest people I have ever met, a lot of whom have taken their time to sort of explain stuff to me, you know, because I don't have amazing math, never did have, and so on. But they've taken their time to explain things to me because I'm participating and I've given back. So it really has given me an amazing career in doing this stuff and explaining this stuff. And so please, if you find any of this interesting, you find the workings of this stuff interesting, do, you know, start to contribute. I'm always happy to help people if they want to raise an issue and aren't sure how to put that together. Very happy to do that, because I'm very keen that more people get involved with this and get involved with making all of this better for all of us for the future. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
We have time for questions?
Yeah, if you want to. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so I can run around with the mic if you guys have any. Perfect.
Before lunch questions are always...
That's right, it's quite a in-depth, very specific question as well. Gap. Grid gap. Which one? Because you can use, it seems like you've got grid gap was the initial, and then there's now being introduced gap that will potentially be used for Flexbox as well. This might not be the right time to answer the question, but is it a case of grid gap is going to be replaced?
It's aliased. It'll hang around forever because of the not breaking the web. So what happened when the Microsoft version of Grid didn't have any gap properties, we already have column gap for multi-column layout. I pushed for about a year for us to get gutter properties, to be able to have a gap between tracks in Grid. We got them, we called them grid gap, grid row gap, grid column gap, and then we're like, hang on. We've already got column gap for multicol, and it would be quite useful to have gaps in Flexbox. So they were basically renamed to make them more generic. That's happening all over the place in CSS. But they were renamed to make them more generic with alias. So browsers alias essentially is like shorthands. So they will hang around forever. If you've got grid gap in your code, it will work forever, I'm sure. But Firefox have now implemented the gap properties for Flexbox. So that's another thing that would be really nice to get Chrome to implement, because having the gap properties in Flexbox means you don't have to do like the horrible negative margin thing on the outside and so on. So yeah, that's really what's happened there. They're going to be aliased.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Everyone's like, let me go to lunch.
Okay. I think we're on.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Rachel here, folks.